Hello, everyone. Today we have some amazing guests that are trying to help make me legal in Washington State. So, well, maybe I'll just let you introduce yourselves and tell us why you're so passionate and why you're working towards making me legal. Elise, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Elise Bias. I go by she, her pronouns. I am a native Chamorro from the island of Guam, but I currently live on Duwamish land, presently known as Seattle. And I am a board member of the Psychedelic Medicine Alliance of Washington. And the reason why I'm really working to change the legislation on it is, there's so much incredible research that's coming out from renowned institutions on the benefits of psychedelic medicine and their ability to help with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other mental health conditions. But aside from the Western research, I think it's always important to acknowledge that many of these medicines were actually used by indigenous cultures for thousands of years in their spiritual and cultural practices. And many of these cultures didn't actually use them to prevent depression or to prevent anxiety. It was used on a regular basis, almost as a way to they use it as a way to prevent, not to treat depression or anxiety. So, and this was by maintaining a connection with themselves, with their community, with the land, and with spirit. And so, I think that the illegality of these substances here really prevent us from making meaningful progress in those areas.
Thanks so much. And yeah, it's very interesting to look at the history too, because sometimes people think psychedelics are relatively new or from the 60s, but they're really not.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
People have been really exploring this for thousands and thousands of years. Cody, how about you?
Hi, all right. My name's Cody Zelesky. I'm from the exotic land of Wisconsin, who has moved out to Washington, I guess, about 7 years ago. And, I think there's definitely a really interesting psychedelic culture out here on the West Coast. And the reason I'm involved in this is, several years ago, I think around 2017, 2018, I made a list, and it was a list of the things that I thought with my skill set that I could be involved in and I could apply my efforts to and change the world for the better. And one of those things was working on psilocybin decriminalization, working on psychedelic decriminalization. I think there's just so much potential for so many of these substances. I mean, currently we're in what's called the Psychedelic Renaissance. We're finding out all of this research that was buried for the past 50 years, thanks to the Controlled Substances Act, is now coming to light, and we're now re-exploring it again. And we're finding out that, wow, some of these things are just fantastic for treating, our mental health epidemic. Like, for example, we're finding psychedelics have an efficacy rate for treating a variety of different manifestations of substance use disorder, between like 35 and 50%. And if you compare that to, for example, 12-step programs, they have an efficacy rate of maybe between like 8 to like 20% long-term, abstinence from, nicotine, from alcohol, from opiates. And so it just seems to me like this is an incredibly important area that people need to be involved in and people need to be pushing for to try to, better our communities, try to, help out our neighbors and friends and family. And so that's ultimately why I'm here. There's also some other reasons, and I can get into that a little bit more, but anyway, I'll shut up for now.
Thanks. I, for one, am very glad you made that list and actually took action. So thank you. James, how about you?
Hey, I'm James Parabello, and I am a state independent contract lobbyist here, and mostly work on the state level, a little bit of federal and local stuff too. Um, yeah, I've worked around in and around the Washington State Legislature for about 20 years now, working for both House and Senate members, and then the governor for a while. then worked at the Liquor and Cannabis Board for a while, helping them implement the legal cannabis market. But it was just at the beginning of this last legislative session when my old friend and colleague, John Ingber, reached out to me and asked if I'd like to be a part of the campaign to legalize psilocybin here in Washington. And I just jumped at the chance to do that for the same reasons that both Elise and Cody have outlined here. But for me, personally, I think I have always been pretty fascinated by the alternative treatments that could be that psilocybin has the potential to offer to folks beyond the traditional, cabal of pharmaceutical companies out there that are creating new things that often have side effects that are sometimes worse for you holistically. And as others mentioned, this does not have those same kinds of drawbacks and side effects. I've also, part of the reason I was fascinated by working on legalizing cannabis and now this is simply for the elimination of the traditional war on drugs that has been waged in America for decades and it's been failing so many people, creating greater societal injustices in the criminal justice system, especially for disenfranchised BIPOC communities. And I'm just always looking for ways to help causes that support those communities that bring greater just levels of justice throughout our society, and this is one of those ways. And also, the psychedelic culture has always been, I'm a huge music nerd myself, and some of my favorite artists are big fans of psychedelics. So by default, I have been my whole life too.
Now, James, from what I understand, you also host the Clash show on KEXP, right?
I play a supporting role in
you play a support,
that government affairs role for International Clash Day across the world, led by Seattle's own KEXP, a nonprofit radio station here.
All right.
Thanks for that, Cody.
Yeah, that's so cool. I'm wondering if maybe we can explain to the audience a bit about the difference between decriminalization and legalization, because I know that Cody and Elise, your organization, Psychedelic Medicine Alliance Washington, did something really amazing in Seattle with a decriminalization bill that you passed. But what really is the difference between that and legalization? Are there limits? And how did you even manage to pass a bill?
Wow, that's a long story. How did you manage to pass it?
Yeah, I was going to say, Cody, you take that one.
Okay. All right. So at least in terms of, the first question you've posed, so what is the difference between legalization and decriminalization? So the way I would describe decriminalization is similar to the way society treats caffeine, for example. You can go to a coffee shop or you can go to a grocery store, you can get a bag of coffee. It's not regulated, has no unique taxes applied to it, no age regulations. Whereas legalization, this would be more similar to how we treat cannabis here in Washington state, or how we treat alcohol, or how the state of Oregon treats psilocybin. This is where you do have a legal framework for this to operate under. You do have special taxes that are applied. You do have age limits. There are only certain individuals who can utilize these substances in certain contexts. So it's not just a free for all where everyone can just go out and use it wherever. And so that's how I would describe the primary difference between decriminalization and legalization. And I would also say there are some gray areas that exist between that as well. Now, how we actually accomplish that, I feel like maybe we can get into the details a bit more. Also, as we talk more, but it was really just a matter of playing the game of politics, talking to the right people, talking to the people who know people, and convincing them that this is something that they need to be interested in. This is something that they need to take action on, because people really want to see many of these natural psychedelics decriminalized, or accessible at least. So when talking to a lot of politicians, I really want to emphasize this for anyone else who is interested in this topic and also is kind of curious, like, hey, what can I do in my community to make this happen? And you're talking to these politicians, and they have a lot of crap on their plate. Like, these folks are, for the most part, worried about kitchen table issues. They fix potholes, they trim the trees around power lines, especially in your local community. At the state level, they're managing budget stuff. Like, you need to sell it to them and convince them, like, hey, this would help so many people in our community if this was more accessible. And a lot of them are they're not necessarily opposed to the idea of psychedelic decriminalization. They're not necessarily they're not hostile to it. It's just a lot of them just simply don't have the time and don't care. And so it's selling it to them in a way that makes them want to care, and saying, hey, you know what, here in Seattle, we have an opioid epidemic. We have a homelessness crisis. We have people out in the street who are suffering right now. And this is, I've never want to characterize psychedelics as a magic wand that you can just sit down and wave and solve every one problem. But it's one of many tools in the toolbox that can be used and can be implemented to help better the world around us and help improve people's lives. So in terms of accomplishing it, that's more how I would characterize it. And of course, people are going to have different opinions and different views on how to implement that. Some folks want a very structured legal model, like Oregon does, where you have psilocybin service centers, and there's a lot of regulation around it. And then some people just say, hey, you know what, this should be more decriminalization, that people are smart enough and you can trust people enough to utilize this. In, for example, there's a really interesting model in Oakland where there's like a sacred garden community, where there are natural psychedelics that are grown and used in sort of like therapeutic but also religious manner as well. And so once again, there's a shade of gray that exists between this legalization and this decriminalization realm, and everyone's going to view that differently. And I think our organization is here to facilitate that in whatever way we can possible, because at the end of the day, progress is progress. We think anything aside from the status quo, where we are now, where all these psychedelics are Schedule 1 and completely inaccessible, we think anything from that is an improvement. Did you want to expand on that, Elise?
I think the only thing that I'd like to add is that everything was spearheaded by some incredible leaders, but there was also so many members, passionate members of the community, who were supporting this, who were doing things behind the scenes. They were going to farmers markets. They were putting up posters in their neighborhoods. They were talking to people and everything. So I think that's also a part of it. It's really creating that community and then standing together and showing that there is a group and there are a lot of people who see the benefit and who want to see things change here. Yeah, so wherever you might be looking to implement this as well, create a community and build on that, and have some authentic connections with one another.
Yeah, that sounds like a really great way to start, right? Just talking to people, talking to your environment around you, being open, destigmatizing me and psilocybin and other substances. I do have a question a bit more specific, James, maybe to you to help with this. So under these different frameworks, which of them would allow people, for instance, to test the substance to make sure that it's high quality, or to buy it? Which would that be allowed under decriminalization too, or only in a legalization framework?
Yeah, I think that, sorry, it looks like I'm frozen here.
We see you. I see you.
I think that it's going to take a level of legalization to be able to do that. Decriminalization just means, if law enforcement stops you somewhere, they're not going to prosecute you for that. But if we're talking about legitimizing it in a way that allows laboratories to test it for potency and things like that, or to transport it via freeway and across state lines, if that comes to that someday, that's going to take a level of legalization that we're still working through in cannabis here. It kind of goes back to what Cody was saying. Not only are we, is there a difference between decrim and legalization, but every level of government has to sign off on this as well. So, we could do as we did with cannabis here, and the state can legalize it, but it's still a Schedule I drug on federal level. So that means institutions basically that rely upon federal funding or just could receive the ire of the federal government somehow, they have to be very wary of getting involved. So that means the banking system, the financial system, or lending of credit, things like that to businesses here. They will stay away from it, as they do in the cannabis industry, until the federal government says, either this is legal now, or they issue some kind of letter of agreement that says that this, we're going to basically look the other way, as they did with the states. They submitted some guidelines on cannabis that said if you meet these requirements of the federal government, then we're basically going to look the other way for now, until Congress takes action. The same, it's kind of playing out the same way here now, where we have the states experimenting with legalization, and the feds will keep an eye on it, but there will be complexities along the way to work out for sure.
Yeah, and speaking of legal, came to the Senate hearing for Bill 5660. Can you explain what happened with that? Where are we on the path to legalization? Who wants to go first?
So
yeah.
Why don't I leave that? I'll leave the beginning to Cody and Elise, because I came into this late in the game.
Yeah, Cody, Elise.
Yeah. Okay. So, where we are with this right now. So, we, like, you were saying before, we had a great turnout for, 5660. For those of you who don't know, that was a fantastic bill introduced by one of our state senators here in Washington State, Senator Jesse Solomon, 36th District. And this is fantastic. It's one of the first psilocybin service bills introduced in the entire United States, or I think even in the world. So Washington State is trying to be on the cutting edge of psilocybin and psychedelic legalization and decriminalization. And I think that's, once again, maybe part of the culture out on the West Coast here. But of course, the legislative session ended, I think, like last month, and so 5660 managed to make it up to the committee it needed to go through, the Health and Long-Term Care Committee, but it did not make, so the committee did not vote it out of their organization up to a normal vote you would have to the entire Senate, and then it would go to the House, and then it needs to be signed by the governor. So it goes through all of these steps, but it died in committee, unfortunately. But we had such a great turnout at this hearing for 5660. I mean, we had dozens of people show up. I think we had 300, 400 people sign up to say they support it and were in favor of this bill. And I think they were not expecting that. This Health and Long-Term Care Committee, they thought this was some weird esoteric issue for a bunch of hippies in Seattle or somewhere, and they just want to do mushrooms and whatever. But I think we showed them that no, that isn't the case, that there are a lot of people who do take this seriously and aren't just, you know, a bunch of you know, hippies who want to trip balls. So as of the budget, so you know, every year, you know, the state government signed the budget, and so in this budget there was a proviso that is for $200,000, and this proviso funds a work group to examine how psilocybin services would be implemented in Washington state. And so it looks at some other organizations like, you know, the OPB in Oregon, and you know, trying to learn from what some of these other states are doing in terms of psilocybin service legalization, and learning from them and seeing how we would implement that here in Washington state. And so this would, you know, continue through the end of the year. And so it is signed into law, it will happen. And then what this will do is it will make things a little easier next year when this bill is reintroduced. There's every intention of reintroducing it next year. And then you sit down with some of these lawmakers, you give them a little PDF of your findings and say, you know, here are our findings, here's everything you need to know about the topic. Because once again, you have to remember that, of course, everyone listening to this podcast, you know, we all care a lot about psychedelics and psychedelic legalization and decriminalization, but a lot of these politicians, you know, once again, they are concerned with kitchen table issues. They are concerned with budget crap. They are concerned with fixing potholes and trimming trees around power lines. And so they don't know anything about this. I mean, their understanding of psychedelics, more often than not, I mean, there have been a couple of exceptions, but almost entirely, you know, they think this is something, you know, that happened in the 1960s that, you know, made, you know, the Manson dude go crazy and commit a bunch of murders, and, you know, make people jump out of windows. And that is the limit of their understanding. So in that sense, getting this information to them and having this work group and having the funding for this work group to be able to, you know, help inform them and get them up to speed what is happening right now with the psychedelic renaissance, that is incredibly important. That is an incredibly necessary step in ensuring that psychedelic decriminalization and legalization happen here in Washington state. And hopefully we can inspire folks elsewhere too to take action on this, because like in Oregon, they did a ballot initiative. And the thing is with ballot initiatives, those are not cheap. They're very expensive, very labor intensive. And having legislators that actually care about this and are willing to put this through the legislative process is, I would say, a much easier route that folks in other states can take. I mean, once again, you don't even have ballot initiatives in all the states either. So I think this is providing a slightly different roadmap for people to take to implement psilocybin services in their own states as well. Anyone want to expound upon that?
Yeah, I guess I'll add just a little bit more, consider baseball from the legislative perspective, I guess. Cody, you did a great job explaining a lot of that. For those not too familiar with how the legislature works here, it's a part-time legislature. Like Cody mentioned, all these legislators are elected by their districts to convene in Olympia every January. And in this year, the session lasted for only 60 days, which means they have a lot of work to do in those 60 days. And every legislative committee hearing is packed with other bills that they have to contemplate and deliberate and debate, and make it through the process, as well as pass a supplemental budget. For a lot of these legislators, as Cody said, it was a completely new topic. And what we often find is bills that introduce completely new concepts or topics to them can often take years to get passed, because it takes educating the legislators, and usually that is very hard to do during the legislative session. They just don't have time to be learning about new things and diving into them as much as we'd like them to be, when so much is coming at them. So that's what this interim between sessions will be all about, is educating more legislators about this. That's why it's so important that we got that funding in the budget. Thanks to our prime sponsor, Jesse Solomon, the senator, who sponsored the bill, and then the chairwoman of the Senate Healthcare Committee in Cleveland, especially the vice chair, Senator David Frocht, who really, after the hearing, I think he felt that we made very compelling arguments, and his eyes were open to the benefits to psilocybin treatments, and really helped push through, I think, this proviso that got into the final budget. And thanks to the governor for signing off on the final budget, including this, and the healthcare administration's their final budget, because ultimately it's the governor who signs off on all the spending, and could veto this if he didn't think it was legitimate or didn't approve of it. So all of those folks get a big thank you. But this proviso is so important because it's going to task state agencies, two healthcare agencies, and the Liquor and Cannabis Board in coming together and actually putting some work into what a regulatory structure could look like for legalized psilocybin treatment in Washington State. And their opinions are going to matter come next session, when the senators and the representatives convene again, and we'll be asking those agencies what they think of this legislation, and whether or not this is a legitimate cause that they should approve and take to the next level. So the task force work is going to be, in my vision, the mission of this task force is to basically get these agencies to sign off on a working plan that they can live with going forward. So when they go into the healthcare committee next year, they can say, yeah, we worked with these task force members and the industry, and we have refined the bill from last year, and we think this structure, this regulatory structure, could work in Washington State, and that's going to alleviate a lot of the concerns that legislators have going forward. And I think we'll see more legislators that we plan to work with this interim. I think we'll see more of them get on board and have their eyes opened as well, and hopefully we'll take it to the next level next year.
Yeah, thanks so much for that explanation. And we know that in Oregon, the beginning of 2023, they're going to start providing licenses for psilocybin services and facilitators. And I have a question: if you'd actually want to see things from Oregon being improved in the next bill in Washington, if you have any ideas on that. Elise, I see your head moving. Maybe start with you.
Yeah. So actually, Paul Stamets, who's a leading mycologist and an advocate for medicinal mushrooms, he's pointed out that the Oregon bill doesn't include microdosing, which is consumption of very small amounts of psilocybin that aren't felt. So you could take a microdose and go about your day as normal. And based on the Oregon bill, you would have to pay to go to a facility in order to microdose, when you can just do that safely in your own home. So that's one thing that I think I would definitely work to add or implement for Washington. But also, I personally am more for decriminalization versus legalization, only because I feel that it would create more access for marginalized communities and help them to actually participate in psychedelic economy. So I think that it's really important that we're including people from all walks of life, indigenous cultures, BIPOC leaders in the psychedelic space, veterans, including them all in the creation of legislation so that it genuinely will benefit the population versus just larger corporations, kind of like what we're seeing with the cannabis industry and with cannabis legalization. yeah, so I'll pass it over to Cody to offer some thoughts on Oregon bill.
Yeah, so Oregon is a great first step. They went out on the limb. They managed to pass their ballot initiative, and we're super happy for them for that. I think there are some things that we can definitely improve on here in Washington State, and frankly, we are improving upon. Like Elise said, we would like to see some minor changes made for microdosing, because let's face it, if you're at a psilocybin service center and you go to take a microdose, and the rules are that you have to stay there for like 4 or 6 hours or something, with the assumption that this law was written that you'd be taking a full trip, and you're just gonna be sitting there for all these hours bored out of your gourd, and it's kind of silly that you would need to do that for a microdose. Also, one of the other areas we would like to see improved is, for example, like home services. So, for folks who might be disabled, who might not be able to travel as much, being able to engage in teleconferencing with a psilocybin service provider, or at least with an intake session. Being able to do the initial intake session over video conferencing would hopefully alleviate some of that burden as well. And another concern is cost. For example, I'm not sure if you're aware of ketamine therapy and ketamine clinics. Those can be incredibly cost prohibitive, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of dollars per session. And we would really hate to see that happen with psilocybin, and just make it completely inaccessible for some of the people who need this most. People from lower socioeconomic status, and technically legal, but can you actually pay for it? Can you actually use it? That's going to be a huge concern as well. And so we're exploring ways to try and make this more equitable and more available for everyone can access these tools and these resources. I do know the bill also has some provisions for including marginalized communities in some of these psilocybin licensing program services. So that's another place where Oregon maybe fell short, and especially we've fallen short here in Washington State with regards to cannabis. That many of the people and many of the individuals from groups that were harmed by the war on drugs were suddenly it's legal, and they were cut out of any of the benefits and any of the boon from this sudden market that just opened up. So that's definitely unfortunate. It's definitely something we really would not want to see replicated. Once again, we want to make this as equitable and as affordable as possible, with a minimal amount of ridiculous rules and red tape, so people can access this. And I think we're doing good progress here in Washington relative to Oregon, and I believe there are a few more changes that were made between the two. And I know I didn't list off all of them. If anyone else can remember those.
James, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I guess I would just add, I totally second what Elise and Cody said. I think they're spot on. I'd love to see the tribal involvement, the 29 federally organized tribes of Washington really take this issue on, and in a way that they did with cannabis, and exercise their tribal sovereignty in treating indigenous members of our society. From my lobbying perspective, I just want to avoid some of the pitfalls that we've experienced in implementing the legal cannabis market here in Washington. But mostly, I just want to see a large sentient truffle at the bill signing next year. I'd love to see you.
Sounds good. I'd love to be there. There's one small thing I wanted to explain about taking very small pieces of me, microdosing, as we were talking about. So people might still be able to feel it. Especially, we're seeing in research that people feel more energy, but it's not hallucinogenic, right? So people don't see visuals; they can interact with you. You're not going to notice that they are on a psychedelic. They might feel the difference, and that's part of why some people want to use it, and why it definitely makes sense to have different regulations that don't need as much close supervision. Um, but as always, I think what I would like to see is really the focus around the support structures. If it's education, if it's community, being able to do this in groups, which is, traditionally really how people have been doing these substances, I think is really important. Um, and as well as acknowledging people's past knowledge. As far as I know, in Oregon, if people have been doing this for years now as an underground therapist or as part of a tribe, that education isn't considered, and they're going to need to study everything from the beginning again. So these are things I personally would like to see. Now, I know nobody here can see the future, but we are getting a question from Josh Coleman, which I think many people are thinking, like, what is the timeline? When do you think we might be seeing legalization? And maybe you can say, like, optimistic, pessimistic estimates. And of course, this is just, your personal feelings. And maybe afterwards we can talk about how we can make the optimistic perspective come true.
Yeah, I would say optimistically, I would really like to see this happen in 2023 here in Washington State. Once again, with this funding that we have for our work group, looking at psilocybin legalization, I really do think that that's going to expedite the process relative to, without it. And I think that we can potentially, if we put forward enough of an effort and we convince lawmakers that should be high enough on the priority list for them to address in 2023, I think we can definitely do it next year. We do have a longer legislative session next year, and lawmakers will be more familiar with it. We hope to, we hope to broaden our base of support over the next year as well. In Washington, and hopefully we see that in other states as well. You look at, outside of Washington State, I believe Hawaii just funded a task force looking at psilocybin legalization as well. I believe there are funding for task forces in Utah and Texas, and I can't remember if Pennsylvania passed it or died in their legislature. But yeah, you're seeing this in many different states. I think Utah and Texas are actually MDMA treatments for veterans. But you are, once again, with the Psychedelic Renaissance, you are seeing movement, you are seeing actions in many different states from people of many different ideological persuasions. And you see this kind of social shift that's occurring. And you saw a similar thing happen with cannabis, maybe like 10 years back. I think, where we are with psilocybin and psychedelics, we're just, 10 years behind cannabis, I think overall there is a shifting social perspective with regards to substance use, just kind of all across the board. And there's more of an increasing perception that this is something related to personal autonomy rather than punitive enforcement of drug laws and throwing people in prison for choosing whatever substances they want to put in their body. At least that's what I think of. What I hope is that there's this broader social shift and broader social understanding. I think you look at some of the egregious missteps that, for example, the DEA has taken with regards to putting substances on the Schedule 1 category list. And people have, in a certain sense, lost faith in the DEA and some of these government institutions to be making these sound decisions. And, thankfully, as a result of that, we have things like psilocybin now becoming more accessible to people as we reevaluate this historical perspective with regard to drug law. So yeah, I would say optimistically next year. Um, you know, pessimistically, I mean, who knows? This stuff is always a moving target.
Mhm.
So I can't predict the future.
Yeah. We
Uh,
could stay with the optimistic version.
yeah. I know this next November, it's during the midterms. They're in Colorado, I believe there is going to be a ballot initiative for I forget if it's just psilocybin or if it's all plant-based psychedelics. Or I should say plant and fungi-based psychedelics. I have a biology background. You would think I should know this. So yeah, I do know that Colorado is going to be having a ballot initiative this upcoming year, or I think I don't know if they have all the signatures, but it sounds very promising from what I've heard. So there's movement all over the place. Here in Washington, if it takes longer than 2023, it just means we need to have more conversations with lawmakers. It means we need to have more conversations in the community and, get more people on board with this. Thankfully, we haven't really seen a whole lot of opposition. I mean, the opposition has been, very remote. I mean, we're talking like, I don't know, kind of reactionary Facebook groups. That's been about it. So, yeah, I mean, people are by and large at least open to the idea. There hasn't been any blowback yet. So, we have our fingers crossed.
How about you, Elise? Do you share this optimistic view?
Yeah, I do. Like Cody mentioned, I think there's a lot of people, especially here in Seattle, that are, yeah, they're just great proponents for psychedelic medicine. And it's starting to expand in other areas of Washington state. So I think that, yeah, optimistic, maybe 1 year for some kind of positive policy changes, but it could also be 3 to 5. And I only say 3 because when you look at Oregon, they passed their bill, but then it's taking I think like 2 years for them to actually create the program, to create the guidelines and the safety rules and everything around the program before implementation. So even if there was some kind of change in policy, 2023, there would be maybe a couple of years before we actually start seeing psychedelics out in the market or being used legally.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, 3 to 5 years, and I think some of the more pessimistic estimates, I would agree with you there, Elise. I think that's a good guess.
And how about you, James?
Yeah, I think their Elise and Cody's assessment is pretty right on. I think like we said, cannabis took years to legalize here, and it took some incremental steps. It wasn't like we went from completely illegal to a legal market by passing one bill. There was the medical marijuana bill that passed years before, which allowed for some quasi legal operations to sell to patients. But there's a lot of work to do over this interim. There is a ballot, or there should be a ballot initiative this year, led by the ACLU and another coalition, or a greater coalition led by them, that it will try to decriminalize not only these substances but all illegal or illicit substances, and there's going to be a lot of support here for that in Washington, but there's also going to be a lot of detractors, and with some of the legislators that I talk to, while they may be supportive and see the benefits of certain substances being decriminalized or legalized, they're maybe a little bit reticent about fully opening the door to all. And I think, we may or may not just or agree with them on that, but we have to recognize that they have their opinions, and they're legitimate or not. We're going to have to just make our case as to why we see the benefits in going down this road for psilocybin. Um, and I'd also mention that this year there's a huge turnover. It's a campaign year for the legislature, which means every state representative has to run for office again, and a handful of senators also, whose terms are up this year. There are some, I think it's probably pushing 30 members of the legislature who are not coming back, which means there are going to be 30 new legislators that will be here, and that's not including the ones that may lose their races and be replaced by another candidate. So, we can see a huge amount of turnover this year, which means we will have to educate all those new faces in the legislature as well. But that goes back to the work we have to do this interim, that everybody has to do, everybody watching this has to do. Find out who's running in your district, in your local municipality or whatever, and simply ask them the question: do you support legalizing this? And here's why I support it. And make the same case to them, and that will really help us. Everybody fighting this fight going forward. When we get around to talking with them in the future here, if they know that there's support in their own district for this, they're going to be much more inclined to support this. So they need to hear from everyone out there, candidate or elected official or otherwise. They need to hear from you early and often. Go reach out to their campaign or show up to one of their events, a fundraiser event or whatever, and talk to them about this bill and about the support for it. And that will really help us hit the ground running next year.
Yeah, you mentioned the ballot initiative that Commit to Change is running. I just want to mention that our organization is endorsing that. So it's called I-1922, and like James was saying, it essentially removes drug possession laws from the books. There are still going to be laws in the books for for selling illicit substances, but in terms of just possession, I mean, it's decriminalization. This is similar to what a few other countries in the world have done, such as Portugal, and have found it very, very effective in a very effective approach in dealing with substance use disorder. Treating it as a mental health problem rather than treating it as a criminal justice problem. And so what 1922 also does is it takes the marijuana, there's a marijuana excise tax. So, when you buy cannabis here in Washington State, there's a hefty tax on it. And then it goes into a big general fund for the legislature to spend how they want. What this does is it takes a fair amount of that tax. I want to say 140 million or something, a rather high sum, and puts it towards, treatment of substance use disorder, rather than, just having them spend it how they want. So I think it's a really neat way of rethinking and restructuring some of the ways we think about drug law here in Washington. And so this organization, Commit to Change, they're going to be gathering signatures, I believe, sometime over the next week. And then they'll have until the beginning of July to continue collecting signatures. And they need a lot of them. So if you live here in Washington, if you know anyone here in Washington who wants to be involved in that and wants to, help us out and, get that done in November, I'm sure they love your help. We would love your help with that too. And yeah, I just wanted to, add on to that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we heard James recommending contacting senators and new people that are actually running this year. We heard you recommend signing petitions for the decrim bill. Elise, do you have any other recommendations of how people can get more involved and supporting these initiatives?
Yeah, just try to find that community again. If there's a community that's passionate about psychedelic medicine, connect with them, because that's where you're really going to get a lot of that continued inspiration, but then also just the extra support. As I mentioned before, it was really a collective progress and collective thing that happened with PMA Washington. There were so many people behind the scenes. And so if you're able to find that group, there's a likelihood that you'll connect with people who are wanting to change the legislation around it. So, yeah, and for me, I would also say, like, just spread love and love yourself and spread love, and continue to do the work that you're doing. Thank you for the work that you're doing, if you are.
Could you tell people how to connect to PMAW and to your groups?
Yes, so we have a website up. Oh man, I forgot. I don't actually know the link off the top of my head.
It's pmaw.org. And I think,
great. Thanks, Cody.
Yeah, and I believe we do have our email domain set up. So at info@pmaw.org, that should work. If you have any questions about getting involved, if you have any questions about what we've done out here in Seattle and out here in Washington State, we're very excited to help other people in other communities replicate what we've done out here. To build a little bit on what James and Elise were saying, it's not even a matter of exclusively contacting your state level officials either. Reach out to your mayor, reach out to your city council members. I will say, at a local level, at lower levels of government, it's much easier to change, relative to going higher up the food chain, if you will. And so, that was our philosophy here. It's, you need a much smaller group of very committed people to affect change at a local level. And, if you have like 4 or 5 people, and you email your city council member, that'll probably get their attention. I mean, even in Seattle, with a city of 700,000 people, there's not a whole lot of us. We're talking. I mean, there's dozens. There's dozens of us. So you don't need a lot of people to affect this kind of change in your community. It's just showing that you're passionate, showing that you care. And once again, some of your local officials might be kind of skeptical, but say, hey, you know what? We need this kind of local grassroots endorsement to be able to affect change at the state level. We need this sort of institutional support, here locally, and then you start moving up the food chain, and then people like Jesse Solomon here in Washington State start to take notice and go, oh, maybe we should do something about that. And then if enough states start to take action, like with cannabis, then you have start to have movement on the federal level. And so it's just working your way up the food chain to affect change. And it's just those very small, seemingly insignificant, minute efforts that people are putting in all across the country, all across the world, to improve things. And I encourage you, if this is something you really care about, just take those small efforts. Email your city council member, your state representative, or if you live in another country, your local provincial officials or whatever, and start making those movements, because it's about normalization, and it's about just social acceptance, I think, more than anything else.
Yeah, so we can create a little mycelium network of change that will hopefully transform the environment around us. Thank you so much. I am going to leave you one last question of, do you have any other words of wisdom really to end this podcast with?
Well, I mentioned before, some of the reasons that I got involved with, with trying to, decriminalize and legalize some of these psychedelic substances. And, I mentioned before, they're very good at treating a whole host of various mental health ailments. And increasingly, it's just, I feel at the root of so many of our problems, our disagreements, you have 2 things. You have fear and you have distrust. And these things corrode and eat away at ourselves. These things corrode and eat away at our relationships with other people. And I think psychedelics, their power is in helping to mitigate that fear and that distrust. And, I mean, if any of you are science fiction nerd, I mean, fear is the mind killer. It's little death that brings total oblivion. And psychedelics can help rectify that, and can help patch up all of those stupid fears and all those stupid anxieties and distrust that we have, and to help us build a better world, and build better interactions and better social relationships. And of course, they're not a magic wand; they're a tool, and the intention in which they are used is important. But I think with that intention, we can really improve the future. And I would really encourage other people to get motivated and take those little actions in your community and in your state and wherever, and hopefully make these more accessible to the people who need them. And that would be the only little bit of advice that I have left.
Thank you. James, how about you? Any last words of wisdom? And I'm going to share the PMAW site so people can see it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have any thoughts as eloquent as Cody there, but yeah, I came to this fight pretty late in the game, as I mentioned at the beginning. But this topic has always been fascinating to me. Most of what I know about psychedelics has been either from music, like I said, or National Geographic, and I'm fascinated by the history of psychedelic use, and the findings that show that it could be that human creativity and intellect actually could be rooted in early psychedelic use, and so I think there's just so much to discover still about it, and it's really just, it feels great and awesome to be on the cutting edge of this, and bringing back something that helped humanity out for eons. But on the political side, I would just say, really don't count yourself short when it comes to your ability to have an effect on state policy and federal policy. I mean, you'd be amazed at how easy it is to reach out to a local legislator, and the access. There's not a legislator who wouldn't take the time to have a phone call or a Zoom or meet in person for coffee, to talk. Give you 15 minutes or 30 minutes to talk about an issue. Most of them, wherever they are on the political spectrum, are going to be open-minded, or at least they're going to listen to what you have to say, and there are going to be minds that are going to be changed over this in this next year here in Washington, and support is only going to grow, but that's going to take everyone reaching out to their local legislators, and like I said, you're going to be amazed at the progress we can make when everybody participates.
Thank you so much. I believe that's true. And Elise, any words of wisdom?
First, I want to say I'm definitely far from wise, but I will offer some final thoughts. Psychedelic medicines are very powerful, and they can really result in life-changing experiences. And oftentimes we talk about them as being healing. And I'm sorry. Oops. We talk about them as being healing. And I just want to note that it's not the substances or the medicines themselves that do the healing. They open the doors, they point us in the right direction. But ultimately, we heal ourselves. And what it is that we are seeking when we work with psychedelic medicines, whether that's healing or peace or love, that already exists innately within ourselves. And psychedelics, the plant medicines, they are just great partners and great friends that help us to become more aware of this. But thank you all. Love you all so much. Sending so much love.
I don't have hands, but I am making a love symbol with my face. So thank you very much. And yeah, we'll stay in touch and let's see how this next legislative session goes and how much influence we can have there. Thank you and goodbye.